In 2024, Europeans will be heading to the polls once again, as they do every 5 years, from June 6th to June 9th. With more than 400 million people eligible to vote, the elections to the European Parliament are the second largest democratic elections in the world, after India's. This year, just like with every European Parliament election in recent memory, there is much anticipation about the rise of the extreme right and populist parties. In previous elections, this fear usually dissipated as the traditional center-left and center-right forces that built the European Union forged coalitions that held more radical parties at bay. Yet the outcome of this election could be different. The first to take place after Brexit came into force, and since the election of far-right leaders such as Georgia Meloni in Italy, it comes at a time when the extreme right surge seems bigger and bolder. Polls are predicting the nationalist right and far right could pick up nearly a quarter of seats in the European Parliament in June. The European context is marked by increased concerns about ongoing immigration, a sluggish economy, and security amidst tense geopolitics. In this episode of Who is Voting in 2024, we ask, could we eventually see a European Parliament dominated by the far right? How resilient are the EU institutions that many of us Europeans tend to take for granted to the rise of the extreme right? I am joined by two excellent guests, Christine Tonn, research affiliate at the Albert Hirschman Center on Democracy, and Nathalie Brack, associate professor at the Department of Political Science of the Université Libre de Bruxelles. I will start with a question for you, Nathalie. Extremist parties are gaining grounds across Europe, but this has been a trend for some time. What is different about this current context and this current election? Is there something different?
Yes, there is. Not so much the media attention to far-right parties, because as you said, it has been going on for a decade or so. The far-right will be the biggest winner in June, that's for sure, and it's a consolidation of an ongoing trend. So they will increase their share from 20 to 25%, but that's not the main novelty. It's more a continuation of a trend. I would say there are several new elements. The first one is that the EU is becoming more like the member states, where we also see that trend. So it's a sort of normalization of the far right that we see, as you said, in Italy, but also in France or in the Netherlands, where the far right won the election. Another element is that in some countries that we thought were immune to the far right, we see these actors gaining ground, like in Germany with the AfD, or in Spain with Vox, or in Estonia. So now everywhere in Europe, the radical right is becoming an actor that we have to take into account. And then another element that is new is more the shift of the center right, who has become more open to cooperating with far-right actors at the national level, but also at the European level, where the main candidates, the president of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, said that she's open to some sort of cooperation with the ECR. And we see this week in Croatia as well, a new coalition between the center-right and the far-right at the national level. So that's the normalization of those actors on the one hand, the emergence in some countries, and then the openness of the center-right to cooperate with these actors in Europe.
Thank you very much, Nathalie. This leads quite well, I think, into a question for Christine now. So we often imagine the EU and the far right at odds with each other, rather. Yet, as Nathalie just mentioned, there appears to be a rapprochement between the president of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, and far-right leaders such as Meloni. Has this sparked any issues within the president's own party? Could you tell us more?
Yes, actually, von der Leyen has received quite a bit of criticism from the center-left and partly from within her party as well for becoming this friendly with Meloni, Italy's prime minister. Because let's not forget, Meloni's party, Brothers of Italy, has neo-fascist roots. And with the EU elections coming up, the Commission president will also be newly elected. Von der Leyen will need Meloni's support to get voted into her second term of office, especially in the run-up to the EU elections now, everything's becoming hyper-politicized. Also within von der Leyen's own European political party. Again, given one example of how these things have cooked up, most recently, Hungary had seen its funds, some of the EU funds suspended for rule of law concerns under a new tool, a new budget tool. And the European Parliament has sued the Commission for having unfrozen these funds recently. And among the people that support this suing is her own party, so von der Leyen's own party in the European Parliament, which just shows it's quite a move of Manfred Weber, who is the leader of the European People's Party in the European Parliament, to politically go against their own main candidate.
Absolutely. Now, let me go back to Natalie. So we often speak of the far right and the rise of the far right in sort of a blanket statement, but perhaps that's not right. That's not the right way to go about it. And I would like to ask you, what are the common trends or differences in the ideologies and strategies employed by far right parties across Europe to gain electoral success in the European elections?
Yeah, so let me start by the ideology. They have a core ideology which is similar to all those parties that has been theorized by scholars. Basically, it's three main characteristics. Nativism, so there is a hierarchy in society depending on criteria like race or gender or religion. Then authoritarianism, with these parties putting the focus on law and order. And then populism. So the world is split between bad, corrupt elites on the one hand and the good people on the other hand, with, of course, the definition of the people being quite exclusionary. And then they have, in Europe, an extra addition, Euroscepticism. So those elements are common to all radical right parties, and it explains their Euroscepticism. They're against Brussels as an elite project, but they also have moderated their position on Europe since Brexit. So the vast majority do not advocate anymore to exit the EU. And they also use a similar strategy. They use a lot social media. They propose simple solutions, usually populist with a populist style. They're very anti-elite. They mobilize on the resentment of people, and they stress migration as the key issue in general. But there are also differences. For instance, the parties in the European Parliament that are more in the ECR group, the conservative group, they put a lot of focus on conservatism, on values, on identity, gender, the traditions, that kind of issues, whereas the far right in identity and democracy, it's more about migration as such. And they're also split because they are in two groups, but even within those groups in the European Parliament, for instance, socio-economic issues, the AfD in Germany, it's much more pro-market, where others like the Rassemblement National is more protectionist or for protection of the people and less neoliberal. Even on migration, they're divided. For instance, La Lega in Italy, they voted in favor of a European approach to migration, whereas Rassemblement National is against that kind of EU action. And of course, on the issue of Ukraine and Russia, some members are pro-Russia, whereas other parties are more supportive of Ukraine. So there are a lot of differences even among those parties in Europe.
Thank you so much, Natalie. This is very interesting. Christine, you are authoring a book on how the European Parliament has protected itself against far-right actors at the EU level. Can you tell us a little bit more about the inner mechanisms that the institution has to respond to far-right influence? Perhaps there's not a single answer to that, but a multiple one according to what kind of influence, what kind of party, at what time?
Yes, my forthcoming book titled Defending Democracy in the European Parliament deals with exactly that. How has Parliament responded to far-right parties that got voted into office? I think one key argument of the book is that the responses are not very straightforward and not one-sided, exactly, and that the far-right has infiltrated many different political groups, and that who is considered far-right very much varies who you are asking, and that also definitions are shifting. It has been a very complex mechanism or microcosm, but let me highlight a few strategies that I identified. One is probably the most well-known, the cordon sanitaire. So this measure by traditional political groups, mainly pro-European, do not cooperate with far-right parties. And that can vary on a scale from, for instance, blocking the election of these parties and members to positions of power in parliament, to choosing categorically to not work with them on legislative amendments or to vote against any amendments they put forward. That's one strategy, though even here, if you look a bit closer, you can see that there is cooperation at different levels. And my book untangles these complexities, tries to untangle these complexities. Another one is Parliament's internal rules of procedure, where I've seen very clearly that measures against, for instance, extremist and defamatory language have become much stricter over time. In the beginning, those didn't exist when the first free elections took place in 1979, and they only got introduced recently. if, for instance, a member of parliament uses hate speech in plenary, the sanctions have become much stricter. Another way to counter the influence of far-right parties, even though this is not taken just specifically at the far right, but at all groups, is the rules on party formation have become stricter. There are more members needed to form a political group, and there are requirements for how many member states must be represented in this group. So because these political groups are made up of national parties, there's a certain number that's required for how many national parties need to be part of that political group. And most recently, each group also has to sign a declaration of that they share common values, just sometimes not the case. And maybe one last thing, at the broader level, the European Parliament has launched a rule of law through the Article 7 procedure, which is enshrined in the EU treaties. And ultimately, that could allow to suspend the rights of a member state in the Council, because at the EU level, you cannot suspend or you cannot make a member state exit the EU. That's just not foreseen in the treaties. And Parliament launched that, even though right now it is stuck with the Council, which represents the leaders of the member states and the ministers. And you could see that Parliament has been pushing very much to take action on the rule of law and the protection of democratic values, just to give you a few examples.
Thank you. That's so interesting. Allow me to follow up with a question that's perhaps a bit simple. But so you're mentioning, Christine, all of these different mechanisms to self-protect in a way. Could these mechanisms be jeopardized if the extreme right parties gain ground both at the member state level and then also at the parliament? Or are they institutionally there to stay?
That's a very good question, because for right now, the traditional party, the center-left, the center-right are still from the biggest majorities in parliament. But if that would not be the case anymore, of course, if there are sufficient majorities, they could change the rules of procedure, for instance, in parliament. So nothing is cut in stone. That's why, yes, these upcoming elections are quite crucial to see and how far the internal balance will change. If there are more leaders, more far-right leaders around the table, of course, you could also reverse certain actions taken or certain procedures that are in process.
Thank you. So this episode sits within a broader podcast series on democracy in 2024, elections in 2024. And the question is also, what impacts could the rise of the far-right parties in the European Parliament elections challenge broader principles of democracy, particularly in terms of minority rights, freedom of expression, the rule of law? In a way, how worried should we be? And is there anything that perhaps concerns EU citizens can do to counter these trends?
Yeah, so it has been for some time on the agenda, the issue of democratic backsliding and rule of law in general in Europe. It started with a few member states, but now it's a little bit spreading. So I'm quite concerned, because I think we have now a conflict on the meaning of liberal democracy and the issue of minority rights and the balance of powers. And I think with the rise of radical right parties, the far right in general, we should all be concerned for the future of democracy as we have it now in Europe. As Christine said, the European Parliament has been quite vocal on the issue, but it's still the Commission and the member states who are much more powerful than the Parliament to tackle that issue. And I would say I would put the focus on what political parties now during the campaign can do, because it's the root of the issue is, of course, the rise and the success of these parties, far-right parties. So it's more what the competitors at the national level can do. And there's been interesting studies on that, for instance, showing that, of course, you shouldn't you shouldn't focus your campaign on migration, and you shouldn't copy the solution provided by the far right to be successful. But also in the framework specifically of the European elections, that it would be detrimental to focus on the success of the European Commission, although it's a temptation now, but most people are not happy with the achievement of the European Commission over the last 10 years, whether it's on Ukraine or the COVID or the economic crisis or the climate. So if you focus too much on those achievements to say, look, we did a good job, it would actually provide more support for the far right, who can then mobilize on the resentment of the people. And on the positive side, parties should really much remain authentic to their own ideology and provide answers to the concerns of citizens, because you can understand that people are not happy. But instead of turning to the far right for simple solution, traditional parties or other parties can perhaps renew their appeal by staying authentic to their own ideology and then respond to the concerns of the voters based on their own ideology to remain credible and to have a narrative that is appealing to voters. And Europe is in danger, especially in big countries where the far right has become normalized, because it's not working anymore. You have to provide a new narrative of why Europe matters to you and why it's important, but also what traditional parties can do for you instead of turning to the far right. And perhaps that way we can have a more healthy debate, which is less focused on the norms and values of liberal democracy.
Thank you. That's excellent. Maybe I can follow up with a quick question for Christine. So a challenge that the European Parliament has faced traditionally is low voter turnout. And it seems that matters as well quite a lot when it comes to the outcomes of the elections in June. What can be done to perhaps increase this voter turnout between now and June? And what do you expect the turnout to be this June? Will it all be just like, as usual, quite low? Will we see European citizens perhaps who are feeling threatened by the rise of the extreme right take to the polls, or not so much? What do we expect to see, and what can be done?
Okay, so traditionally, the European Parliament elections have had quite a low voter turnout, and it usually has mobilized people with strong opinions, so either very anti-EU or very pro-EU. But we've seen in the last European Parliament elections in 2019 that the voter turnout has been higher than before. So I could imagine, given the political situation today, with the war in Ukraine, the media attention given to the rise of the far right, the climate crisis, that people have been mobilizing more around these issues. Especially when I look at Germany, people have been going out onto the streets following the secret meeting of far-right extremist leaders. So there you can see an increasing political mobilization among young people out on the streets. One downside, though, I think, is that the national elections are not harmonized. So that means the European elections in some countries are just the European elections. In other countries, they take place at the same time as the national elections. If there would be a harmonization, for instance, of the election cycles, I could imagine that would also give more visibility. So to have a genuine European debate about European politics and not only linked to the national political atmosphere at that moment.
Thank you, Christine. And then this segues nicely into a last question for both of you, which is connected to the important geopolitical challenges that the world is facing. The EU has a tense relationship with China. The war in Ukraine has now been dragging on for a number of years. Of course, there are more recent developments in the Middle East. And the EU is a central actor in both of those, both in Ukraine and in the Middle East. So how are these poised to impact the European Parliament elections? Maybe I'll start with you, Natalie.
So there are several elements here. The first one, as we just talked about, it's the model of democracy that Europe will defend on the global stage. Then there is the conflict at the border of Europe with Ukraine and Russia. And there, I think European election will have a big impact on whether we can imagine a European defense in the future. Most parties are more or less in favor, but then it's a step further to have a European defense. And then the elections in the US will be crucial to determine whether Europe will develop on that front or not, because Trump has never hid the fact that he doesn't want the US to be more involved in NATO and defense issues. Then we have Russia, of course, and a lot of far-right parties having links to Russia, and it's in the interest of Russia, but also of China, to have a divided Europe. So they will continue to support that kind of dissent within European societies and to have a more polarized society. So it plays in the hands of that kind of actors. And then what we've seen, and I think it's very interesting the last few years, it's the transnational networks of the far right, also supported by foreign players. So we had a conservative, it's an euphemism, conference in Brussels a few weeks ago with a lot of speakers from around the world talking about norms and values. And then we had also in Budapest, in Hungary, where Hungary is playing a big role in that kind of network, inviting foreign speakers, including from the US and the new right and the alt-right and the far right, talking about cooperation and how to spread their ideas and support each other and giving advice and everything. So I think that kind of transnational or international networks of far right will also play a role in the years to come around the world.
Maybe I can also add a small thing on the impact of this geopolitical context on the internal workings of the institutions. As recently we've seen, for instance, Orban, who is pro-Russian, has been consistently blocking the negotiations on funding for Ukraine, so much that the European Council had to have a special meeting at the end of February or beginning of March this year to really convince Orban to unblock his veto power on his veto against funding for Ukraine, which also shows that the war in Ukraine and why the geopolitical issues really have a direct impact also on the functioning of the institutions. And in the European Parliament, we're also seeing that the far right is very divided on the Russia question. Some being pro-Russian, others take a stance against Russia. So also in terms of after the elections, how will the coalition building will be going? That's to be seen. We can expect that the far right will not manage to have one big bloc with a harmonized approach. I think partly because of the Russia question.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, both of you, for this very nuanced and clarifying discussion.